I want to suggest to you that of all the stories that I've heard, and I suspect of the stories you may have been telling each other, there are some themes that have been coming through from the COVID experience. And I know not all the stories are positive, but focusing on where the stories have been positive, where there have been silver linings, the themes that I've been noticing are these three things. The first of them is that during the COVID experience, I think what's happened is there's been an extraordinary crystallizing of purpose, of what matters. Now, that may only have been for a fleeting moment at the start of the experience where we were in crisis response mode. But what I noticed was that there was this sort of clear and galvanizing priority that emerged that was about what we can do individually and collectively to create value in the world, to kind of do something that we all know matters and that's important. So there was a moment of really seeing through the fog, seeing past all our individual priorities and all our sort of separate issues to find something that really mattered and really mattered to all of us. I think partly related to that, there's also been a clearing away of some of the normal causes of friction. So in the story I told before the breakout rooms, some of the friction that we see in our day-to-day work is in the red tape that kind of constrains us at times. But there's also friction between, the different priorities, friction between different roles and responsibilities, friction sometimes caused by the different things that we measure that leave us not necessarily pulling together, but pulling against each other. And again, for a moment at least through COVID, it seems like we've been able to get past that. And actually, there's been some very deliberate action taken that's allowed us to get past that. Targets have been suspended, normal funding rules have been relaxed, and so on. So friction has dissipated in the system, which has allowed us to get things done pretty quickly in the context of that clearing of the fog. And I think the third thing that I've seen is that has both benefited from and to some extent created a sense of fellowship, a sense of we're kind of in it together. And where we have been able to cut through the red tape and just get stuff that matters done, it's given us a sense of actually pride in work, being able to do stuff that matters without wrestling with the usual nonsense. And from all of that, I think fellowship has grown, partly because, as I say, we've been in it together, but also knowing that each other really understands what matters and that everyone's putting a shift in to get it done, I think has increased the quantum of trust that we've displayed in each other, which feeds fellowship too. So for me, I think key learnings from the COVID experience are, can we do things as we enter the next phase and as we hopefully eventually leave this crisis to keep the fog cleared, to keep the friction out, and to keep growing that sense of fellowship so that things get easier, better, faster, cheaper, the more we do it. And I personally think that is entirely doable. It's within our gift. And I think we also owe it to ourselves as we come through this crisis to make sure that we do that and that, as the saying goes, we don't waste a good crisis. So it's these three things that I particularly want to talk to you about in the context of how do we do it for real? And my first sort of answer to how we do it for real is by being really, really careful about how we learn from the crisis. So some of you might have read the blog that myself, Jeremy and Dave did on this. And one of the things that we're seeing, and we understand is very well intended, is lots of sort of lesson learned activities that, roughly speaking, if we start in the bottom left corner of this diagram, see, we know there's been lots of innovation going on in different places. So can we gather that up by asking, what have we learned? Can we put it into a process where we make decisions about what to keep, what to get rid of, what to amplify, etc.? And can we then turn those into things that we're going to scale and spread? And my first prompt to you folks is that I'm not sure that any of that really relies on using the principles that have worked so well for us in COVID. There is a sense, in fact, that working in that way, we might incur a few risks. So first of all, there's a change in focus in working in that way. the focus goes from attending to what does the world need from us right now, to actually focusing inwards, to sort of saying, what can we feed into the system, rather than what can we provide outward to those that need value from us. There's also at times a tendency to focus on what are the innovations themselves, and not so much what is the environment that's enabled the innovations. And of course, we do want to learn from the innovations themselves, but not if that means that we sacrifice the opportunity to keep on innovating, to keep on getting better. And that leads to, I think, the second bullet point here, which is about adopting the approach to learning that is about pushing learning to the centre, potentially dangerously shifts the locus of control. So where the locus of learning and innovation has been sort of out and close to our communities for the most part, there's a danger that we suck learning to the centre and we turn that learning into projects and programs and specifications and targets and all of those sorts of things to get passed back down a hierarchy. So in a sense, what's worked so well during COVID, one might argue, is that we've pushed authority to where the innovation and expertise already is existing. But as we learn from COVID, there's a danger that we push our expertise and innovation to authority. So it's the exact opposite logic. And again, I think, you know, we could argue the toss on all of those points and say, well, it's not an either or, it's a both and. And I think that's true to some extent. But my third bullet point kicks in there, which is there is a cost to learning from the centre. There is a cost to running big initiatives and programs at scale and pushing them through hierarchy. And that cost is primarily to our bandwidth. So if one of the things that's been so compelling through COVID is our ability to act in a relatively unconstrained way, where the main constraint is coming from what the world needs rather than what's being directed from hierarchy, there is a real risk that our bandwidth to just keep on innovating and making sense of what the world needs is consumed by essentially looking upwards in terms of focus, consumed by things taking longer to get into action in terms of the locus of control, and consumed by just the amount of stuff raining down on us as we leave crisis. So I think there's material risks to learning from the crisis if that is about learning from the centre. But I don't think we need to give up on the idea of learning. So I want to suggest to you that recovery and reinvention in practice might work better for us if we ask the what if question. If we ask, what if we put all our energy into becoming really, really expert at making sense of what the world needs from us and responding to it by putting the locus of control as close to or even in our communities? And what if we, if you like, lean on that leg heavier than leaning on the other leg, which is kind of capturing the innovations and cascading them through programs and projects? Yes, it might be both. And yes, maybe a balanced approach is to stand with equal weight in both legs. But my concern, my suggestion is that we're so used to leaning on the right leg that we need to learn how to lean on the left. So I think we need to favour sense and respond over capture and cascade. And I think what that means in terms of how we capture and share learning is that we focus much more on nurturing the relationships, the fellowship that started to build or that we've been building on. That we think maybe in terms of how we create spaces and platforms that make it easy for us to pool our learning, in other words, to kind of throw it into the hat, and also make it easy to pool PULL learning. In other words, as we encounter issues and opportunities, as we're focused on creating value for the world, we can go to these places and grab stuff we need to help us solve the problems we've got. That, I think, is a materially different way to approach learning than the one that we've started to see quite a bit of, which is reporting learning to the centre and that getting prioritised for programmes, projects and push initiatives. So you may have all sorts of thoughts on that. I hope you're chucking them all in the comments for the guys to respond to and for us to come back to later. But today is about doing this in practice. So what I want to focus on now is what are the things that we at Easier Inc. are doing to put that into practice. And I'm going to introduce you in a minute to a couple of clients who'll talk to you about that as well. So, but how? Well, It's maybe unsurprising. The first place that we tend to start when we look at this is with purpose. I want to be very specific about what I mean by purpose, though. So purpose for us is not some vanilla vision statement. It's not a kind of rallying call for the troops that's designed to inspire. It's actually just something deeply practical, something that helps people to have operational clarity around when I'm in my job at the sharp end doing the things I do, how do I know what matters here? And we think, and the way we work with our clients is when we talk about purpose, we talk about that by looking from the perspective of what the world needs from us, not from the perspective of what as an organization matters to us. So that's about situating yourself in what's the kind of value proposition, the socially orientated value proposition of our work. What's the world need from us? And we've learned in doing that, there's a couple of things that really matter. So the first is that it's value to the world, not our own preoccupations. The second is that that's positively framed. So let me give you an example of that. So when we work with local authority planning departments, so this is departments that approve applications to put things like conservatories on houses or build extensions or so on. One way to describe the purpose is to say, well, our job is to stop bad development. And when you look at the world through that lens, you tend to incline a perspective which is, how do we say no to these applications? But when we design purpose the other way around and we say, no, what the value is that the world wants from us is to enable good development, you do very different things. For instance, you put your energy and resources into pre-application advice. You make it easier for people to understand what the types of development they could do that would meet their needs and benefit the community. And so framing purpose from a positive and social lens is a really powerful way to help people to anchor to what is it that really matters in my job. So to see through the fog, if that's one of the principles we're trying to work to here, being really clear about purpose and defining that from the perspective of value to the world in a positive way is a good place to start. But that's not enough, right? So one of the things that we often find is that you have that moment of clarity around purpose, and then you move from purpose to people, and you think of all the people, all the stakeholders in your place of work and in your communities, and all the differences in their perspective and all the things that matter to them. And suddenly it goes from that moment of clarity to that really diverse set of perspectives, and the fog comes back in. But if we're to embrace this other principle, not fog, but now fellowship, we need to give a damn about what matters to each other. So understanding these outcomes and how they relate to our purpose is really important. So the second thing we do with lots of our clients is we encourage them to think about who matters and what matters to those people. And that is an opportunity to really listen to each other and to empathize, but it's also an opportunity to put what matters to each other in the context of a clear purpose together. So that's about growing this sense of fellowship. And from there, we then need to think about, okay, so if all these people matter and there's all these diverse perspectives and outcomes that matter, how do we get the clarity back that allows us to act? And what we found is really useful there is to move from thinking about outcomes to thinking about what are the processes that create those outcomes. And when we look at those processes, what are the few things that really, really matter within the processes of work that mean that those outcomes can be delivered? So we call those the capabilities. And if I give you another example of that, just very briefly, if I was running, for example, a service that repaired, let's say, dishwashers in people's homes, my purpose might be to repair or replace broken dishwashers for people. Something simple and operational like that. The outcomes that matter, well, for my finance director, it might be how much that costs. From HR director, it's are we looking after the people and getting the most of them? For my customers, it's is it fixed? So the diversity creeps back in. But in terms of the things that we need to do really, really well to meet that purpose, I would suggest to you that it's as simple as We need to get into people's houses, we need to understand what's broken, and we need to fix it or replace it. So access, diagnose, and fix. Those would be three core capabilities for a service whose purpose was to fix broken dishwashers. Now, that might sound extraordinarily simplistic, but the point is, when we look at even complex processes of work, very, very often, in fact, I haven't found a contrary example yet, what we found is by distilling things down to what are only the necessary and sufficient capabilities that would deliver the purpose, what we find is the vast majority of outcomes that matter are delivered as a consequence of focusing on those few things. And that's really important, because what it allows us to do is go from all that sort of diversity, I clicked the wrong way, to narrowing our focus right back in again to say, well, if we can collaborate around becoming brilliant at these few things, then not only will we meet our purpose, but actually the things that matter to each of us will be delivered as a consequence. Now, you may be sitting there thinking that sounds rather too simple, and if you are, you would be right, because the next step in this when we work with clients is, even though we might have got clarity around those few capabilities, when you start looking at what are the things that affect our ability to do those few things well, consistently, all of the time, guess what? Things get broad again. You start to see loads of issues, loads of patterns that affect the work. So in the example I was giving of the repairs to dishwashers, things that we might see would be, how easy is it to get access? If that's the first thing we need to be good at, access, then diagnose, then fix. How easy is it to get access? And this is actually from a real example of a company we've worked with. And when we asked that question, the answer was 40% of the time they would go to people's houses and they wouldn't be in. So that's an important problem to start solving. When it comes to diagnosis, in the real example, what we saw was actually 95% of the time we didn't get the diagnosis right first time, but that was because we tried to diagnose it over the phone before going. So what we learned was you have to have access first, then diagnosis. Without getting caught up too much in the example, the point I'm making is that even when you have that clarity around what are the few things we need to be great at, very quickly the fog creeps back in, and it's around all the issues that create the friction between how we work, what matters to us, and our purpose. So what matters then is the ability to take those patterns and to again see through the fog to define some clear priorities. And if that's at all sounding like sort of normal business to you, the thing I want to suggest, and the thing that our clients tell us, is that it's the middle step around the capabilities that they most often don't have in place. So often people have clarity of purpose. Often they have lots of priorities, in fact, so many priorities that they don't really have any at all. But what they lack often is that anchoring point of what are the few things we need to be brilliant at. And our experience is it's getting crystal clear on those, and then having a good process by which to pick priorities and work on them systematically, that we can see through the fog, that we can build fellowship, and that we can systematically remove the friction. So that's quite abstract, I appreciate, and I want to hand you over to people who are going to give you real world examples in a moment. I'm just going to finish up on this conceptual framework here though, which is to say that what you've got on screen just now feels perhaps like a service design methodology or how to run a project, and of course you can use it that way. But the way we think about it is that this is really a process of learning how to build shared understanding, situational awareness, to build fellowship and collective action, and therefore it's not a project, it's a how we work thing. So this process of moving from right to left, what we call left shifting, is actually a process of learning how to have what we call the conversations that make work better. And if we really pay attention to how we're having those conversations, they can become a habit. So it ceases to be a project and it becomes a way of being together that allows us to get better and better and better, that allows us to keep the fog out, to keep the friction out, and to keep the fellowship going. And of course, closing the loop, means that there are other conversations that make work better too, which is about right shifting. It's about how do we take what we've learned and start to act on it. So this becomes something of a continuous improvement cycle, but a cycle that isn't just a technical process, it's a social process too. It's about those human connections, those human conversations that allow us to see through the fog and build fellowship. So hopefully the conceptual framework makes sense. I'm now going to shut up and hand over to Saskia Dorman. Saskia is a consultant in palliative medicine. She's been using this framework in her work on end-of-life care. I'm going to invite Saskia to talk to you about that for a minute. Saskia, are you there?
I am there, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yep, so if you just tell me to click when you're ready, Saskia, and I'll leave it to you.
Sure. Thanks. I think you could click on to the next slide now then. Thanks, Andy. So yeah, I'm Saskia Dorman. I'm a palliative medicine consultant based in Dorset. We're all really keen to have high quality services that are there when they're needed, and for people to experience good outcomes throughout their life, and particularly towards the end of life. So we've been thinking about what that means towards the end of life, and that there's a lot of quality indicators out there nationally. This report from the Health Foundation talked about teams navigating a maze of quality indicators, and that really rings true. It can make it really hard to focus on what really matters. I think, Andy, you talked about if we've got so many priorities that it means that we don't really have any priorities at all. So there's just some examples of some of the national indicators available. So to try and see through the fog of all that, we've been doing some work which was funded through NHS England and with the help of Easier Inc. As a thinking partner in that. Do you want to go on to the next slide, Andy? So a small group of us got together, about 6 of us got together from across Dorset and had to think about our purpose, which we defined as, in my last year of life, help me to live well until I die. And that sounds really simple, but it took quite a lot of thinking together to define that purpose in a kind of no-nonsense way from the perspective of someone approaching the end of their life. Again, as Andy said, that's not enough just to define purpose. We need to see what it actually means in practice. So we thought through about what that means, kind of, if you think about the last year of life and the beginning, middle and ending of that. We listened to lots and lots of different people about that, what that means in practice. That included people with personal experience, people with professional experience, local organisations, national organisations, social media and so on. And we came up with a really long list of lots of things that we thought needed to happen for that last year of life to be as good as possible. Again, really difficult to focus on hundreds of things all at the same time. So we then kind of refined that down to just 6 core capabilities, looking at what's necessary and sufficient to achieve our purpose. So these are the relatively few things that if we do these things well, we can be really confident that the outcomes are as we would like from the perspective of all sorts of different stakeholders. And then we went on to validate those 6 core capabilities with stakeholders, and that actually led to it being 7 core capabilities. So we kind of reworded them slightly, and we ended up with these, which are recognising when the last months, weeks and days of life are approaching, helping people to be as comfortable as they want to be throughout, helping people to understand and anticipate what might happen, understanding what really matters to them and focusing on that together, helping them to live well in their community, supporting through on this in a way that feels right to them, and making sure that those close feel supported as well. So those were our 7 core capabilities or success statements. And thinking about that then became quite a simple frame to look at what was really happening in practice and whether that reality matched what we were trying to achieve. So we looked at a few people's experiences in depth, and we were able to understand not just what happened, but why those things happened the way they did, and what makes it harder or easier to help people live well until they die. So one of the people we looked at together as a group, we looked at the story of a couple in their 90s. The lady was nearing the end of her life. She'd taken to her bed. She wasn't managing to get to the bathroom anymore. She and her husband were finding it difficult to manage that. And on the last day of her life, she was kind of rushed into hospital. And in that last hour or so of her life, she was kind of hoisted. She developed a pressure ulcer, and she was hoisted so that a photo could be taken of the pressure ulcer. And that was just an hour or 2 before this lady died. And that's obviously just nowhere near what any of us would want, either as an experience or an outcome. But rather than just thinking people just need to try harder to do better things. We were kind of trying to unpick why that happened the way it did, and that's how we ended up with this diagram on the right, which kind of summarises what we found. So we saw that it's harder to support people well at the end of life when we focus just on the diagnosis of what's wrong rather than what matters to them and what's strong. It's harder when we just focus on tick box assessments rather than understanding who someone is, their context, their story. It's harder when we focus on just on interventions rather than support. Again, not saying we don't need any of the left-hand side, but business as usual tends to focus very much on the left-hand side, the kind of the tick box assessments, the diagnosis, the interventions, and the organisations or teams, rather than understanding what matters and how best to support people. So, in terms of kind of shifting more towards the right-hand side of that page, or that sketch note, we felt that, or we realised that one of the things we had to be really good at is having conversations about what matters. So whether that's with people who are approaching the end of their life, or their families, or with colleagues. And just on the slide there, you can see an example of a couple of templates we developed. So the top one, what matters to you one, this is something that I and a colleague, Andy Stone, developed to help us learn to have better conversations about what matters. Just been a really helpful way to focus on the kind of key things that you need in a what matters conversation, to be able to capture that, share information, reflect and learn, and that just takes a couple of minutes after a conversation to note down, to reflect. And thinking about conversations in that way has kind of led to different conversations. So just an example of how it's changed my practice. Met a woman a few months back who was in the last weeks of her life, who was becoming very breathless and anxious. Rather than kind of immediately looking for an intervention to help with breathlessness or services which might help, I asked what was important to her. She said she wanted to be at peace, and that led us to a conversation about what she could expect as part of normal dying, which she'd been really frightened about but hadn't really asked about. Family was also really important to her, so we explored how she might be able to have a conversation with her young granddaughter about dying and what support she might need to help her with that. So she found that really reassuring. She was much calmer afterwards, and it wasn't just helpful to her and her family as she was reaching the end of life, but also we know that breathlessness is a really, really common reason for people to come into hospital. So if we can kind of think in a different way, have better conversations with people, then we can avert a whole load of interventions and activity towards the end of life. The second template that's at the bottom right there is a template which we developed to help us in our shared reflective practice as part of our team meetings. So that just lists the 7 core capabilities or success statements, and we just rate together how confident we are that those things are true when we're thinking about real people that we're supporting. We think about what makes it harder, what makes it easier, and what we need to do about that, and who's going to do what. So that's helped us to focus both on our shared purpose and some really kind of actionable things. It helps us build a shared understanding of how well that's all going, rather than just thinking that it's all going wonderful. Actually, this helps us to focus on that. And I think on the next slide it shows some comments from colleagues, which I absolutely love, because it's shown that, the one on the left, Amanda, talks about this being the best thing we've done as a team in our meetings. Bev talks about people just being more engaged and feeling more comfortable to share and contribute. I see this as helping our team meetings and our team as a whole to be much more engaged and kind of outward focused rather than very kind of introspective. I'd still say this is a work in progress very much, but it's been a really helpful shift from us just doing the work to focusing on learning together in the work, helping us to see patterns, helps us to support systematic improvements in a way that focuses on what really matters. So it's just been a pretty incredible experience, really, and something that's really good to build on. I'll hand back over to Andy now. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you, so please folk capture them in the comments. I'm conscious we will run out of time, so we'll do our best to respond after this session. What you've got on screen at the minute, though, I think are good examples of what I was meaning when I talked about the conversations that make work better. So having those core capabilities that help us be clear around what really matters, what are the things we need to be great at that mean we get to purpose and we get those outcomes that matter to people, and structuring our conversations and our priorities around them really helps us to remove friction and build fellowship. And one of the things that sometimes happens when working with people is they say, well, how, when we get to that point of seeing the patterns, like Saski's got in this lovely sketch note here, how do we start to prioritize our focus? And there are different ways you can do that, of course, but one that we found that seems to work really well is this simple matrix. So what this matrix says is, along the bottom axis, how easy would it be for us to act on this issue? And on the vertical axis, how big a difference do we think it would make to act on that issue? And by plotting things into this matrix, first of all, what we do is we start to have one of the conversations that makes work better. It builds some shared understandings around what impact and how easy, and therefore what priorities should we have. The other thing it does is it helps you outrule certain things. So if things are really difficult to act on and low impact, so bottom left corner, why would we waste our time and investment there? On the other hand, if they're really easy to act on and really high impact, why on earth wouldn't we do that? Sometimes though, what happens is actually we look at the patterns and many or even all of them end up in the top left box. In other words, it would make a massive difference, but it's really difficult to act on. And so when we work with our clients, often that's a sort of difficult thing for them to wrestle with. And there are a few approaches that we recommend. One of them, many of you be familiar with the work, but it's to run a prototype. So the idea behind a prototype is to say, let's create a sort of artificial environment in which the usual rules are suspended, in which the only thing we need to worry about is how to deliver those core capabilities well. And it's a learning environment, so the job is not to get it perfect first time, but to keep on going through cycles of left shifting and right shifting in order to create something that works well enough for us to start to scale it up. So for us, a prototype is that short-term artificial environment where the usual rules are suspended. And you could argue that what we've been doing through COVID-19 is the world's biggest ever prototype. It's a short-term, hopefully artificial environment in the long run where the usual rules have been suspended. So prototyping is an interesting thing from my point of view because it allows us to usually safely and definitely radically reconceive how we might go about doing the work. And to talk about that for just a couple of minutes, I want to invite Mark Smith, if he's still with us, just to talk a little bit about the prototyping work he's been doing in Gateshead. So Mark, are you there?
I am, yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got you, Mark. Mark, so can I invite you just briefly to say a couple of words and maybe to talk about how prototyping has helped you to see some of the bigger system issues that leaders can act on?
Yeah, happy to do that. Yeah, so we ran some prototypes on the basis that we didn't want to ultimately do a big version of a small thing that we did. We wanted the small thing to tell us about the big levers for change, if you like. So we wanted to work on, we wanted to understand how easy or difficult it was to understand and help people. And we didn't know where to start because our ultimate purpose was around, is around reducing inequality. So we decided just to start with what we knew as a council, which was we knew who owed us money. So what we saw is that when people owed us council tax, we tended to chase them for it, and we'd kind of enter into arrangements with them where they'd say, "Oh, I'll give you £5 a month," and we'd get them off the phone, and of course it would fall down and fail. But instead of doing that, we used council tax debt as a signal, and we set up a prototype whereby we saw who was about to get a visit from the bailiff, and we stopped the bailiff, and we went instead, and we'd say, "Hi, we can see that you're struggling to pay your council tax. How is everything, and how might we help you with that?" And we found by doing that, we were able to talk about the what matters questions. We did this And on only 2 occasions did people tell us to bog off. On all the other occasions, they were relieved, tearful sometimes. No one's asked me how I am for 2 years, was one quote. And what we found with this purpose of help me to thrive, a lot of the people, it's very, feels like it makes sense. And actually what people really wanted was just help me sort my life out. We'll do thrive later. Right now, I'm just completely up to my eyes and stuff. We gave a small team of people carte blanche to do anything they wanted to help against that purpose, provided that it was legal and didn't do any harm. We gave them some money, which they could spend. All we needed to do was measure it. And sure, basically, there's an awful lot to describe. What came out of it was we learned through what Andy's described, that left and right shifting process, and what the things were that made it difficult for us to do what seems like a simple thing. We could infer from casework that the problems were regulations and inspection, our attitude towards it, and their attitude towards us. That commissioning was a problem because we commission for outcomes rather than learning. Frontline empowerment didn't exist, and it should exist. The way the money works was ludicrous because it meant that essentially the work followed the money, whereas the money really ought to follow the work. And we found ourselves being able to make an awful lot of very big statements with evidence behind them about how this was screwing with people's lives from a prototype. We didn't need to do a massive deep dive into the whys and wherefores of the system. We just knew that it was screwing people's lives up, and that we could now see why. So if you want to do the what and the why reasonably quickly, then prototyping can help you, but you need to provide the creative freedom and a clear sense of purpose to enable that to happen. That's as short as I can make it, Andy. Sorry.
I really appreciate that, Mark, and I'm sorry I didn't leave you more time, but thank you. So key things there that I just want to touch on quickly. Mark has this lovely phrase that he uses sometimes, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. But he puts a really useful context on that as well, which is actually going fast and alone in a prototype is not a bad thing, because the quantum of what it can teach you then allows you to go far together on the other issues. Yeah. And I think our experience working with folk like Mark and Saskia and others is that there are predictable patterns for the things that add friction to the system, that add fog to the system, and that erode our sense of fellowship. And they exist in the things that are on the left-hand side of your screen just now. It's not that these topic areas are bad things to do. You know, commissioning is fine. There's nothing wrong with commissioning. But how we commission has a material impact on how easy it is for people to do their work. And I think taking this lens of fog, friction, and fellowship to the areas on screen can help us to find new and better ways to do those things. And through doing that, we can really accelerate and amplify our ability to do good stuff in the world. So given that we're to time, I'm going to very quickly sum up. Principles that have emerged from this work for us have been purpose, got to be defined by social value. Focus has got to be outwards, not upwards. The locus of control has to be held in the work, and that is agnostic to who's holding it. It's just kind of connected to the work. So it could be communities, because that's where the work's happening. It could be citizens hold the locus of control, because that's where the work's happening. But it's about having the locus in the work so that we can sense and respond effectively. Our priorities need to be driven by the work. Otherwise, we have that bandwidth issue. And when it comes to sharing learning, our suggestion is that rather than pulling learning to the center and distributing it outwards, we should explore aloud. Some of the sketch notes that have been in these slides have been produced by people like Saskia as part of the work they've been doing, and it's been a fantastic way to engage people, to share learning, and to get them pulling and pulling in the two senses that are on screen. So hopefully you found this a useful, albeit rapid, run through. In the spirit of exploring aloud, there are a few resources on screen just now, a few communities that we've had the privilege of helping to set up. Next Stage Radicals is a place where people like Mark and Saskia publish blogs and sketch notes and things about the work they're doing. Human Learning Systems is a collaboration between EasyRink and lots of other partners. So we're not claiming ownership of that, but we're really delighted to be part of that. Both of those websites have loads of resources that you can dip into. And there's our EasyRink website where we have an ebook that we're going to send you following this webinar, but we also have a resource section that we'd encourage you to have a look at and dip into. If you can't find stuff there that feels useful, but it feels useful to have a chat, please do get in touch via EasyRink or with any of the partners in EasyRink, myself, Dave and Jeremy that I introduced earlier. And I think given that we're just over time, we will reply to questions and comments after this session by email. So please do update the chat with your questions and comments. Thanks so much for giving us your time, and have a great day. Thanks for joining us, folks.